Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the public meeting. This is the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. My name is Robert Hawkins. I am the MLA for Yellowknife Centre, as well as the Chair of the Standing Committee of Economic Development and Environment. I will quickly run through the members who are in attendance today, just to move things along. I have Ms. Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North, Ms. Kate Reed, MLA for Great Slave, and Mr. Julian Morris in Frame Lake, as well as we'll have a few others joining us, perhaps online and certainly in attendance. And at that time, we'll put them officially on the record. Today, we are joined by the NWT NWT Chamber of Mines, and who will be providing us a briefing regarding the regulatory framework. And please note, for all those who are following along, I would remind all members and guests, of course, to forward all questions through the chair. We are, because we stream live as well as recorded, it's very difficult to follow the conversations. And if we're talking with our mics on, people are millions in the audience online, streaming from all over the world, won't be able to hear us. I'm sure we're running those numbers right now as we live stream. So now I'd like to pass over the mic to Mr. Gary Vivian, who is the chair of Aurora Geoscience, and I believe you're leading the presentation. So please begin and officially introduce our guests, although I know, but for the record. And that said, if you have any other witnesses you'd like to acknowledge at this time. And once you do that, just give us the cue and we'll start with your presentation.
Thank you. Is this working? Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. On my left is Karen Costello, who's the new Executive Director of the NWT and NWT Chamber of Mines, so some opportunity for more of the government to put a face to a name. And then behind me I have the Executive Chair of North Inc., Robin, and I forget her last name. Robin?
Robin Phoenix-Stock, so you're totally right about to get my last name.
Sorry, Robin. And then with Robin is the, she thinks she's Vice President Corporate Sustainability of North Inc. as well, and that's Claudine Lee. And then I think most of you know David. Yep, David Connolly. Sorry, should have said that. And then, yeah. And also, Mr. Chair, we have with us former MP Conservative government, or MP, David Nickerson. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for allowing us to meet with you again. I think just for some quick introductions, just if people don't know, the Chamber was actually established in 1967. And as most people know, we're an advocacy group. An advocacy group promoting our industry to Northerners, Canadians, and the world at large. Today we have the opportunity to address SCEDI, and we appreciate that. Next slide, please. So I just want to remind us all of your request of us, which was to look at the effectiveness and efficiency of the current regulatory framework for land and water use permitting. From a potential duplication perspective, we recommend you also look at the previous 2020 NWT environmental audit, required every 5 years by law under the MVRMA. And note too that the 2025 audit is now currently in progress. We will touch on some of the information in the previous audit and during our presentation. So, next slide. So what we want to do today is first to provide you with some context on why your study is important, and for that we will pick up on our last meeting with you on the economic analysis Eyes Wide Open, which links to this. Secondly, we will speak to some of the details of our industry's land water permitting experiences. We will offer some considerations going forward, and we will close with an important reference to the critical minerals opportunities, and then we'll be open for discussion. Next slide is good. So the regulatory system is critically important to support responsible mining, which is a result of successful exploration. 30 years ago, we had very healthy exploration, which resulted in the diamond mine discoveries that have created these significant benefits. No one can dispute the benefits or the environmental stewardship from the diamond mines. The co-management system was a very significant part of this aspect. People talk about ESG, but this has been going on for almost 30 years in the north. This isn't new. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, as you've learned from the economist Graham Clinton at our last meeting with you, we are in economic trouble now. The reason we are in this situation is in no small part due to challenges created by our regulatory system that negatively affected exploration. Next slide, please. Exploration is the lifeblood to mining, and without it, and without successful results, we cannot sustain a mining industry. We need to keep finding new mines to replace those that eventually close. However, exploration is extremely risky. It's a well-known statistic that only 1 in 1,000 projects becomes a mine. Most explorers fail. It's no joke. Its bingo likely has better odds. But as our bingo friends know, the secret to improving your odds of winning is to play many cards. We need healthy exploration with many projects underway, with many investors attracted here to look for mines. This is where the NWT has been having problems. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of slides here, a couple of graphs here that you've probably seen a million times. But these are government statistics on exploration spending. We've shown the 3 territories in Canada in the top chart. You'll see that compared to the others shown here, NWT exploration was essentially flat. You'll also see in the bottom chart how the NWT has continued to drop in its competitiveness in Canada. Even despite launching its first ever mineral strategy in 2014, the NWT was not able to change its trajectory. Why did this happen? In the broadest sense, you have to remember that money is a coward. Investment goes to less risky, less complex, less expensive, and more attractive jurisdictions. We've shown a few reasons why we underperform, but I won't go into all of those in detail here, as we will stick to the regulatory processes, which were what was required of us. Next slide, please. So these charts show us several things. First, looking at the pattern, the NWT was out of step with Yukon and Nunavut and Canada. Even with the world, we showed the global spending, even if we showed you the world spending pattern. Given our mineral potential is equally as high as Nunavut and the Yukon, and likely greater, the NWT could have seen a similar and healthier pattern of investment. Because NWT didn't attract that pattern of investment, it actually missed out on well over $1 billion of exploration spending. That would have bought a lot of bingo cards and would no doubt have seen more mine discoveries. It was missed opportunity. This could have painted a very different picture that we find ourselves in today with the Wise-Eyed Open report. We know the GNWT inherited the federal government's mess of land and water issues with devolution, but in 10 years they have done nothing to fix it, except continue to exacerbate things with policy creep, i.e. reinterpreting the regs. Next slide, please. And just quickly, if you're interested, here's the Canada and Australia are considered 2 of the largest explorers in the world, and you can see that Canada-wise, we haven't dropped much, and dropped at all. We've basically mirrored Australia, but it's so much easier to put a mine production in Australia. So these are expenditures, and those are basically across Canada. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, this situation hasn't magically healed itself, and we aren't out of the woods yet. The most recent Fraser Institute International Survey of Mining Companies reveals that the NWT is still not healthy. We'll leave it to you to read more in the report, which is we've sent you a link to. I'll just highlight one bullet as it is important for our final slide, and that is that the NWT's mineral potential is at 5th in the world. Next slide, please. So what caused this? Investor confidence has fallen for a variety of reasons and a number of events shown here. We will focus on the two at the bottom, for they are the focus of your work here today. They are the actions of the regulatory boards and the environmental audit's role in identifying this. But I would like to point out one major thing that we've missed in this list was from the 2008 and 2009 drop in expenditures, where you see the most significant drop, was due to the moratorium placed on uranium by the Acacia and specifically Litzel K. This exposed all of the uncertainty for the industry in land and water review processes. After this event, the feds initiated a regulatory review which resulted in the McCrank report. 16 years later, there are no tangible results, and we continue to see policy creep by NWT since devolution. Money loses faith when waiting on promises of change. Next slide, please. Investigations for the audit in 2019 led to a key finding that was published in the 2020 NWT environmental audit. Despite the efforts of land and water boards, small exploration companies continue both to struggle with the application process and to meet its requirements. If allowed to persist, this disconnect between industry and the regulators will continue to affect the level of exploration activity in the territory, which in turn will affect the NWT's socio-economic development. This linked the actions of the land and water boards to negative effects on the NWT's economics. Since exploration was negatively affected, our ability to find new mines was hampered, and thus we are in the eyes wide open situation. Next slide, please. As a result of the audit and industry concerns, government created a process called the Mackenzie Valley Operational Dialogue. Its name describes that it was mandated to only look at operational improvements, i.e. no discussion on regulations or legislation. This changed finally in 2023 due to the federal government's recognition under the critical mineral strategy that Canada's regulatory environment needs improvement if we are to increase production of critical minerals to address climate change. I'd like to add at this point as well, in 2023, there was a change in the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board at both the chair and ED positions, and this provided a new, fresh think. So as Kathy said in her address to the Mackenzie Valley Operational Dialogue back in late May, she knows this won't be easy. It's never easy when you're dealing with regulations. It will require significant education and a need for improved capacity in the communities. So regulatory improvements are now a goal from the boards, and that's from coast to coast. Next slide, please. So here we see there are a list of some of industry's concerns that we wanted to identify through the audit and the MVOD process. We'll speak to them briefly in the following slides. Next slide, please. Early stage grassroots exploration has not advanced, it's not changed, it's been depleted since 2007 and continues to get worse. Through policy creep, we saw many grassroots exploration projects being treated by regulators as advanced projects, which are much larger. This slide shows some examples of what small exploration looks like, but one of the conditions or one of the issues that we brought up in the Mackenzie Valley Operational Dialogue was that the Waters Act and the Waters Regulations has no breakdown for early scale exploration. There's no definition of early stage exploration. And even the boards agree that there needs to be a new schedule placed in the Waters Act for regulations specifically stating or specifically identifying what is small stage exploration, because they get classified as an advanced project way too soon, and the cost to operate under that is basically, it's almost, what's the word I want to use, paralyzing. Next slide, please. So advanced stage exploration, the one thing I would like to fix on this slide right away is, because it was pointed out to me after the fact, is that bulk sampling is not mining. And so the term that was used in that second bullet, more intensive work, more larger drilling, perhaps even underground mining, that reference to mining should have been to remove tonnage for rock samples and evaluation of ore. That's actually an exploration. Bulk sampling is an exploration tool. It's not a mining tool. Now, you might get into those differences when we start talking about lithium, because there's been some examples of taking larger bulk samples to use for mining to prove whether they're an economic value moving forward. But most exploration projects, when they take a bulk sample, it's a requirement to come up with a 43-101 resource to make it a bankable study. So advanced exploration begins once you have found a mineral deposit and are investigating its potential to become a mine. That sees much larger camps, with larger focus in a smaller area. With larger work focused in smaller area. If you're interested, and that's a picture of Divik on the left, in about 1996 when they went underground to remove a bulk sample for testing purposes. This was before enough work had been done to determine if it could become a mine. On the right is the Goose Project, just across the Nunavut boundary, northeast of Yellowknife, a mine that is now under construction. Next slide, please. This is an example of Kennedy Diamonds. Now, it's also considered an advanced stage exploration project, but only because it requires a water license under its needs for a winter road. And I would like to get into this discussion a fair bit because I know a lot about the Kennedy Diamonds project. Part of the problem with Kennedy Diamonds is it's been classified as a mining milling operation because they use the term underground bulk sample. And so therefore, they're forced to go to a Class A water license, which is, they're not even using water in most cases. RC drills don't use water. The only drills that use water are diamond drills and the camp. So there's just not a good definition of the life cycle of mining in either in the MRA or in the board's definitions of what is exploration. Next slide, please. So a big area where we saw the regulators make changes was in water use. The change in their definition pushed small projects up into the realm of Type B water licenses, and even in some cases Type A. And these are first stage exploration projects. I know that LIFT was required to get a Type A water license. Next slide, please. So the action that's required, and just a few weeks ago in late May, the 4 land and water boards of the Mackenzie Valley collectively submitted these regulations to both the Minister of Northern Affairs and the NWT's Environment and Climate Change, Minister of Climate Change, sorry. In essence, the recommendations are to surgically make some changes to the waters regulations to affect some hope now. This isn't an overhaul of the regulations, nor do the boards recommend that. They feel that touching the act is going to take years, and we don't need years now to try and fix a problem. We need months and possibly a year. So this is time for quick action. These are also consistent with Canada's Northern Regulatory Improvement Initiative and other commitments to improve the regulatory system in Canada to seize critical mineral and other energy transition opportunities. So as I mentioned earlier, at the MVOD at the end of May, Kathy Rasher made a statement during her presentation to the MVOD that a new schedule needed to be placed in the water regs that provides a definition of what early stage exploration is and what it applies. I'd also like to state that I was in a meeting with from NWT in January of 2023 who told us almost 1.5 years ago that early stage exploration was never intended to be a water activity under the Waters Act. So how it got there, nobody knows, and now it's classified under miscellaneous. And, okay, you can state that.
Thank you, Mr. Vivian. Ms. Costello, please, if you would lead us forward. It's automatic. We have staff here, so you don't have to press the button. But you can still push your buttons if you want.
You're on.
Don't quit your day job, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. I'm just happy to advise that if the committee is interested in seeing both a copy of the letter provided by the boards and the Chamber's response, we can ensure to share it with the committee through the clerk. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and I'll accept on behalf of committee, just to keep things moving along, and if you need to send it to our committee staff, please do. Mr. Vivian, did you want to continue? Please.
Mr. Chair. So we offer a few, next slide, I don't know if I got to say that or not. So we offer a few observations and considerations for governments and regulators going forward. The first is that regulators and government departments need to be assessing economic benefits, not just the biophysical. The MVRMA is a unique Canadian legislation based in land claims, but also requiring regulatory boards to be seeking economic well-being. The audit flagged they have not done that well. The second is meant to be respectful. Industry is here at the invitation of governments to help them find mines to generate benefits. We are, in many ways, your expert contractor to do this. We have many experienced professionals who have expertise from working all over the world. We experience issues firsthand and can relay them to governments for assistance. The third, it would be helpful to move more quickly on addressing problems, particularly when they're related to the largest private sector contributor to the economy. The concerns of the 2020 audit are still there, and yet we are already now into the 2025 audit process. That's just too long. Next slide, please. To close, I want to leave one more important message around the importance of the work you are doing to seek regulatory improvement. We are entering into the biggest transition in technology and energy use since we switched from the horse to the automobile. It's a global imperative transition energy from fossil fuels if we are to successfully address climate change. Mining is a huge part of this. China was smart and acquired critical mineral supplies early and still continues to. They wanted and have now established market dominance. This is a concern. All of the Western world have developed aggressive strategies to address this. The NWT is some of the highest mineral potential in the world, as identified in the Fraser Institute survey. The NWT is now presented with huge opportunities. This could be timely given the concerns of Eyes Wide Open. Your work to improve the regulatory environment can help seize these opportunities. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity, and we look forward to an open and frank discussion.
Thank you both very much. Ms. Costello, if you wanted to add, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it would be appropriate at this time to hear another specific example of regulatory creep from Norzink in the context of the work that is being done for them to advance Prairie Creek. And I would like to suggest that Claudine Lee speak to that, if I could. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Not a problem. Committee, does anyone have any concerns if we No? Okay. Please, we'd like to welcome Ms. Claudine Lee. Ms. Lee, if you would, please, if you would.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the committee. Again, my name is Claudine Lee. I am the VP of Corporate Social Responsibility with Norzinc. We have a critical minerals project in the Dutcho region, zinc, silver, and lead. We are currently on the cusp of getting started into construction and bringing significant benefits to the Northwest Territories, to the Dutcho region, and to the First Nation partners that we have. As we are one of the projects that are quite advanced and will be the next one moving forward, we are working through a number of authorizations, finalizations of authorizations. In the example of our license of occupation for the road and our surface lease, which are administered underneath the NWT lands administration component, we have seen that the requirement to get these authorizations in place have taken quite a long time. For example, the license occupation for the road took more than a year to get in place, which is longer than getting a water license. Part of the challenge is the duplication of regulatory steps and efforts that have already been completed during an environmental assessment, as well as through the water license and land use permit process. It has been a challenge that I think many in our industry feel that the process itself is unclear and not as laid out as we would see underneath what the water boards do for a water license and land use permit. So timelines are unclear to us, and it is difficult for us to understand when these will come. In the case of our surface lease for Prairie Creek, we submitted our application in August of 2022, almost 2 years ago, and we've just recently received the draft. So a timeline of more than 18 months, almost close to 2 years to get a surface lease in place is very challenging, very prohibitive for us to move forward in a timeline that doesn't allow a project of ours to move forward quickly, effectively, and start to bring those benefits. So there is an opportunity here, as Gary has mentioned, to look at the process itself, look at that regulatory duplication, the work that's being done, and align with what has already been done, the process that has been completed, and the engagement and the steps that have been completed to move a project forward. A project that's been through environmental assessment, water license, and land use permit clearly has been engaged through the requirements under the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act and the authorizations underneath the boards. The Prairie Creek Road project also has been impacted by the interpretation of the water use regs. We need to have a bridge over the Liard River during the winter to be able to construct the road, the mine, and then during operation to move our concentrate out. Because the interpretation that ice bridges are a water use, we were forced to go from a Type B water license to a Type A water license. So we had to go through a regulatory process that is just wrapping up now. We do expect to get our updated Type A water license in the next month here. But that does cascade with additional work, additional resources, additional reviews for all, not just for the company, the proponent, but also for regulators, reviewers, and Indigenous governments. It means a change in the conditions within the license, so it requires a re-review, and in some cases some additional work, and going back to the beginning, looking at some of our management plans and resubmitting them and going through the process again, when there is really no change in environmental use or impact. So that has been an impact for that interpretation. And so getting some more clarity and ensuring that the use of water to build ice bridges is not considered a water use and doesn't push companies who need that as an operational function into the mining category. So those are just two examples currently on the plates of Norzinc and the Canadian Zinc Prairie Creek project. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you for that. Appreciate the highlight. I would probably encourage you to stay there just in case committee members have any questions for clarification specific to your initiative. And if they don't have questions, I'll certainly have questions maybe further about the detail of the overlap or non-concurrent review and process on how you may see duplication areas we can focus in on. But that said, I'm going to proceed to committee first. Committee, the presentation has been completed, I believe. All right, thank you. Perfect. The actual presentation portion. Folks, would anyone committee like to ask a question? I have Mr. Morris first, and we'll take it from there. Mr. Morris, please, if you would lead us off.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming to present today. I appreciate it. You know, I have a few comments to share first, if with the chair's indulgence, and then we'll get on to some specific questions. So I know in the start of your presentation you referenced the environmental audit. I have read it. I'm aware of their recommendations, and one of the things that I've noted is that the 2020 audit spoke to a number of carryover recommendations that weren't done from the 2015 audit. And certainly in asking the department about it during budget time, it's looking like the 2025 audit is likely to be speaking to even more carryover recommendations as they start to build up and are not implemented. Despite this, during questioning at budget time, GNWT insisted that they are adequately resourced to respond to the audits. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring this project forward to committee for consideration was in hope of identifying areas where GNWT should be focusing attention, perhaps to focus on narrowing down the audit recommendations that they need to be focusing on prioritizing over others, as opposed to maybe working on all of them at the same time over a long period of time. So I'm hoping that that's one of the things that could maybe be useful that will come out of committee in this project, is trying to get recommendations, knowing that, you know, the recommendations that this committee can make are to GNWT specifically and not other players. And so I guess I would just say that that's what would be most useful for us to hear back from industry, is what are some of the things that you think GNWT needs to be focusing on. So I guess the first question I would ask is just, I appreciate getting the presentation today, but something that would be very useful, I think, to committee is if the chamber, anybody in industry, I mean, this is a public review, wants to provide kind of written specific recommendations as to some targeted things they would like to see GNWT focusing on. I mean, we've seen the letter from the boards. I think that's something that was supported by industry, also recommending the changes to the waters regs. Recommendations like that, I think, will be helpful in terms of committee producing a useful report that can produce kind of actionable recommendations. That's my hope to get out of this. So I guess that's sort of a statement and a question mixed all in one. If you'd like to respond to that, yeah, it would just, I would appreciate kind of a written submission if possible, with really targeted recommendations that we can put in a report. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Morris. Mr. Vivian, if you want to start us off, and if other witnesses would like to speak, all they just have to do is wave their hand, and I'll proceed from there. So please.
Sure. Thank you, Julian. Yeah, I think probably the direct response to the GNWT side would be through the water regs, because that's essentially what they control when the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board have to deal with regulations. The Waters Act is really what affects the NWT. And our suggestion there is that there's been interpretation changes in the water regs over the last 30 years with no actual change in the regulations that have negatively affected industry. And I would use early stage exploration as an example. You know, basically told us that it was never the intent of the federal government to have early stage mineral exploration need a water license for anything. And through a reinterpretation of the regs, somebody said, well, how can we lump early stage exploration into this? So we got lumped into miscellaneous, so now we're part of the miscellaneous category. And my suggestion would be, and Kathy made it at the MVOD, but it was in conversations that I had with her, is that we need a new schedule that identifies the different phases of the mining life cycle, which is early stage exploration, advanced stage, development, and mining. Those things need to be well laid out, because they are not. And it leaves the boards floundering as to how to deal with the project. And I know, through talking to Sheila numerous times, she says they always try to evaluate what scale the project is at. But without any definitions in there, it makes it very difficult, and it's kind of an open target. So I would suggest that probably our easiest process for writing Specific things down for the GNWT would be on the water regs. But I do know that ITI and the boards talk a fair amount about regulatory stuff because a lot of it comes back to capacity in the communities, and there's a significant piece missing there. And who funds that? The feds, the GNWT, and usually it's industry when we go there. But creating capacity in a community is very, very difficult.
Thank you. Right, Mr. Morris.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I want to switch gears here a little bit to talk about, I appreciate you bringing up Kennedy. As you'll remember, Gary, I worked on that when I was on the boards, or when I, was working at the boards. So that one stood out to me at the time as one of the better submissions I had seen from industry, and could serve as an example of how the system can work better if there's effective system navigation. And very interestingly, the consultant who wrote the 2020 environmental audit was also the consultant who worked on the Kennedy project. So this is a person who understood the system very well. And, in helping Kennedy Diamonds navigate the system, helped them produce an application which proceeded through the boards in a more expedient fashion. So the question I want to get to is, I feel that capacity for system navigation like that is quite small in the territory. And this is perhaps one of the problems. We do have quite a complex system, and simply navigating it can be difficult. So to get to the question about GNWT, I see this as a missing piece. But what I'm curious to hear from industry is this something they want to see GNWT stepping into more? Or is this something where we need to be building the private industry capacity for this? Because I know that ITI has system navigators, but I don't think that their navigation help is quite as technical as maybe what a consultant would do or did with Kennedy. So if you wanted to speak to kind of system navigation, I'd be interested, because this is something that I see GNWT could either step into or perhaps find ways of helping to build that kind of navigation capacity. Which I think could help with this problem of small exploration companies navigating the system.
Thank you, Mr. Morris, and I'd certainly like to hear from Ms. Lee as well. I'm sure she'll have. So, Mr.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Julian, you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, I know you were at the board during the Kennedy application process, and yes, I would suggest our permitting team for that, which was Kathy and Mark, were the best. Unfortunately, they're not in that anymore, and in order to find anybody with any permitting experience, you have to go south, and I always worry about using southerners for permitting because the communities like people, they like to know the people, they like people from the north, and they like to see them. So it's hard to do that permitting process with somebody outside the territory. You probably said something nicer about the ITI group of Pathfinders than I might have. I do think they probably create some value, but my belief is that the Pathfinder group doesn't do enough. It's always been government's responsibility to consult, whether now through DEVO, it's certainly the GNWT's responsibility, but is still the feds. And to me, the unfortunate part of this whole permitting process is the fact that consultation from a federal perspective can be just submitting a land use permit to a community and letting them respond. Well, that's not consultation. If that works, then why isn't engagement good enough? Just sending a project description in to a community and letting that be the engagement. Rather, we're asked to go there because they want to meet us. They want to see us, which I get and I understand, and I think is one of the better parts of the co-management system. But the consultation side is not being met. And I would say it's got exactly to do with what you just spoke of, and that is most of the permitting people are from down south. I'd say the GNWT Pathfinder group isn't funded well enough to get to the communities to educate them on any of these processes. And I love dearly, but we need somebody in there that's got a younger perspective. You know, we aren't, much like myself, 60 and 70-year-old guys running this business anymore. It's young people, and they've got better ideas on how to do things. And I think the Pathfinder Group needs to reflect that. They do a good job, but they don't have the funding to do the job right.
Ms. Lee, do you have any perspective from your current situation? Yeah, please, if you could elaborate for the committee's benefit. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I agree with Gary that the Pathfinders Group do a lot underneath their mandate, which is to help make connections and navigate sort of the larger part of the system. That's only one piece of moving a project through the regulatory system. We definitely do have a really unique and special and really strong regulatory framework here. And for those of us that have been in the industry for a long time, my 20 years working in the North, it comes through experience, and people from outside of that don't know that. And companies coming in might not know the nuances of working through it. But it's not just who the connection is and who you need to talk to and what steps, submit an application, go through a screening. It's really about the content that needs to be in there. And one of the challenges we've seen over the last decade is that the content that has to go into these applications becomes greater and greater. We're being asked for more and more, and we're asked to do more and more early. And those changes, if you're not within this industry and you're not working within it all the time, can be lost and does mean that applications get rejected. They have to go back to the board. They have to go back to the board a number of times to get approved. And if you don't have a very set standard of what needs to be in and what does not need to be in, and more gets asked of you, sometimes your applications don't make it across the line. Help and cooperation from the GNWT is always welcome, but our mandate, again, as Gary said, is a little different because we do have to meet our engagement requirements, and we do need to build our relationships with First Nations. And that's you know, the GNWT's responsibility for consultation is a little bit different. And so though the GNWT definitely can help, and it's always worthwhile to work together to ensure that, you know, we're making the applications go through and that they're not going to get rejected and they're not going to be deemed incomplete or not meet conformance. It's not going to answer all the questions or the challenges that a proponent would have trying to get through the system and the process, which I do feel, and in my experience, we're being asked for more and more. And anytime you put in an application, it generates questions and the scope isn't clearly defined, and more is allowed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. All right. Before I ask a question or go back to Mr. Morris, does anyone else from committee have any questions? Ms. Morgan, if you would please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks to everyone here for coming and sharing these insights. It's really important. I haven't worked within the industry myself, so to hear directly from those working within it is super helpful. So I had some questions of clarification. You mentioned that, or was part of your presentation, that type B water licenses are being treated as type A. So can you clarify, do you feel that the staff or the regulators are not dealing correctly with what should be a type A or what should be a type B, or the problem is with the definitions of what is a type A or type B? I just wondered if you could explain, what does it mean to say that a type B is treated as a type A?
Thank you. And before, maybe I can elaborate. Maybe you can explain what a type A and B is, because that would also help your question, but I wasn't trying to interrupt or steal your question. I was thinking we probably have millions of viewers streaming live, and they don't know the difference between a type A and type B, so that would probably be beneficial. And then if you could get to Ms. Morgan's question, that would probably be a benefit for everyone. Thank you. Please, we'll start with Mr. Vivian, and we'll proceed from there.
Mr. Chair, and for all 10 people online. Thank you for the question, Shauna. So a type B water license is required once you're over 100 cubic meters of water use a day. and up to 300 cubic meters of water use a day. And a type A water license is required for anything more than 300 cubic meters of water a day. There are certain specific mining terms that push you into a Class A right away. One of them is sort of mining milling opportunities, but I think the reason that was put in there is because there's been a big change in how water use is being defined. So you used to be able to run very simply 2 to 3 drills and a camp without a type B water license, which is 100 cubic meters of water a day. A drill commonly uses between 30 and 35 cubic meters of water a day. And commonly a camp will run 5 to 10 cubic meters of water a day. That's would be a normal one anyways, say a 20, 30-man camp. So what happened, I think it might have been 3 or 4 years ago, there was a summer program at Goldterra where on one day, one of the Goldterra drills used over 70 cubic meters of water a day. So that then became the average of what you were requesting when you were providing a land use permit. So if you were having 2 drills and you were going to be evaluated on 140 cubic meters of water a day, that pushed you into a type B right away. Whereas if you were operating under 30 to 35 cubic meters of water a day, which is what a normal drill uses over a 30-day period in a month, if you looked at the average use of water that operates on a drill in a day, it's 30 to 35 cubic meters. So you should be able to run 2 drills and a camp very easily on not requiring a water license. So what's happened is that the regulator was suggesting that running 2 drills, you were getting awfully close to needing a type B. Oh, type Bs are easy to get, so just apply for it. So that's sort of the standard that industry went to. But then there became this idea of charges for water building ice bridges and ice pads and those sorts of things, where if you're building an ice bridge over a river or a lake and you have to build the lake up by 5 feet or 6 feet, you're charged for that water use to build that, although it's going back into the same source when it melts. So that started to create a big problem, and I know that's the problem that Lyft ran into when they were applying for their permits, was the need to create ice bridges to get to their project. And so it's basically a very complex system where I believe that if we got to a point where we could establish what is early stage exploration, what is advanced stage exploration, can we agree with what a drill uses for water on a daily basis, not one historic day in a month, but over a monthly period, if the average is 30 to 35 cubic meters, then that's what you're applying for when you apply for a land use permit. So if you apply for 3 drills, you'll probably need a type B water license. But if you're applying for 2 drills, you should operate on a land use permit only and not a water license. These are some of the regs that have actually changed with the NWT over the last many years that have showed up as reinterpretations of the regs without actually changing the regulations. So they're interpretations, that's all they are. And the unfortunate part is industry has been left out of those discussions when it comes to those reinterpretations, and they just show up. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Mr. Vivian. Ms. Morgan, please. Oh.
Yeah, this may help. Oh, it wasn't. Okay. Thank you for that. And so that helps me to get a much stronger picture of what you're asking for here. So it sounds like that you're asking for the definitions to be based on sort of what an average drill would use, or what a sort of a normal or expected use could be, and then you set up sort of general categories of stages of exploration with what one would generally expect to happen in this, and that companies would get permitted according to that, versus each company having to prove what they're actually using or what their maximum has been historically. Is that what you're suggesting, that they wouldn't have to prove what they're, and I guess the second part of that is the equipment that we're talking about within exploration so standardized that one could just take you know, what one drill uses and then extrapolate or guess what any drill and any exploration project would use. Is it that standardized, or is there a variation in the kinds of equipment that's being used? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morgan. Mr. Vivian, if you would, please.
Thank you, Shauna. Yeah, so to your first question, actually, I'll do your second one first. A certain size drill is standard. So if you were to drill with a 25A or a 37A or a 56, those are standard drills, and everybody knows how much water those things use. The point being is that the size of the hole is the main component. So the bigger the hole, the more water you may have to push down it. But a 56 and a 37 and a 25 and a 17, no matter what you call the drill, if you're drilling a 2-inch hole, which is NQ, or even a bigger hole, we know the volume of water that it takes to keep that hole open. The point being is that at least half to 2/3 of that water is lost in the recirculation. So it's not actually going down the hole. It's not actually used. It's actually going back into the ground and going back into the water table. So it's not actually used. So there's many concerns about that. And those are the things that I think we need to define. Those are the things that require definitions. Now, I know I've been significantly involved in the MRA regulations, and there isn't a lot of definitions included in the regulations, but I think there could be, especially when it comes to interpreting the mining cycle. Like, what stage are you at? Is it early stage? Is it advanced? Is it development? Those sorts of things I think need to be defined. They also need to be defined better with the boards, because the boards have no definition of some of these uses. And sorry, your first question was again about, yes, I did remember, sorry. No matter whether it's a land use permit or a water license, you are regulated to have a water volume tester on every drill. You have to prove that you haven't gone over using 30 or 35, or let's call it a water license, that you haven't gone over using 100 cubic meters of water a day on your project. Because if you have, then the inspector can basically shut you down and say you need a Type B water license. So that's the way that works. So you are expected. Sorry, Mr. Chair. You are expected to report your water use.
Thank you, Mr. Vivian. And Ms. Lee, if you did have anything to offer, feel free to just give me the wave or anything. Okay, thank you for that. That was quite helpful. I have Ms. Reed next. Oh, sorry. Did you want to come to the table? Yes. Well, I don't see committee objecting, so please.
I guess, yeah, right. My name is,
If I have it correct, it is it Bienenstock? Bienenstock. Okay, Ms. Bienenstock. Well, I'll try. If you could officially introduce yourself officially correctly on the record, then we'll proceed with your item. Thank you.
I'm Robin Bienenstock. I'm the executive chair of Norzinc. And our main project is Prairie Creek in the Nahanni. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for some of the conversation that I hear. So as executive chair, I'm responsible for lots of things, but the main thing that I'm responsible for is ensuring that our project is fully financed to be able to do what it should do in a responsible way, environmentally and with regards to the First Nations. As you mentioned, Gary, it's 1 in 1,000 exploration businesses that actually turns into a mine. If you think about that when you're looking for financing, like, would you want to invest, how much of your money are you going to invest in a project that's got a 1 in 1,000 chance, right? There's not a lot of people who are, those don't sound like great odds. And so it's extremely difficult to get financing. It is incrementally difficult in this environment because work is seasonal. So you have a window in which you can get things done. And if you miss that window, you're still going to be paying for that company for the next year. And so that's another, in my case, $10 million for the next year if I miss a window. So the things that matter to ensure that the NWT can drive businesses and move your ratio from 1 to 1,000, there are a number of things. One, time, getting things back in a timely manner, not waiting almost 2 years to get a draft. Two, repetition. If we prove something, we have almost no resources. Think about, if you're a 1 in 1,000 chance for an investment, you don't have huge resources, and you're always trying to figure out where your next money is coming from. So if you have to keep adding resources and there's scope creep on questions, and you have to, you answer a set of questions, and then a year and a half later, you're answering the same set of questions again, but in a slightly different way, and you have to apply resource to that, that's extremely difficult. I think you need to consider that just how scarcely resourced it is. And then the last thing is definition. To your point, why does it matter that things are defined as early, next? It's so you can offer certainty to investors, and you can say, I am through phase 1. I am now in stage 2. I am an early stage explorer, and so I am responsible for these things, and I have absolute certainty that this is a list of stuff that I'm responsible for. And then I can go to investors and I can say, I have ticked those boxes, and therefore I am a better investment, and I can move to stage 2. So having clarity and not interpretation, but clear definitions about which are the gates and which are the stages is immensely important to being able to ensure that you continue to get access to funding so that you can persist and get through gates. And I say that as Prairie Creek when, we've raised, we have about 2/3 of $650 million that we've identified. So we are a long way down that line. I still am scrabbling for $1 million here or there, and I will be doing that for the next, 2 years, and we will be doing that on our project. So if you think about a project like that's that far along, that still, struggles with a new request that is going to cost us however much manpower time, think about what that looks like for an early explorer who's at a very early stage. It's just, they're so onerous that they're business killers. There you go. Sorry. I thought that the context was important. Just, you can do a lot to clarify things and to move the NWT to a place where there is very clear, defined stages, not open to interpretation, that would allow businesses to have the certainty to get investment and move you instead of to 1 in 1,000 to 5, 10, 15, 20 in 1,000. Thank you.
I don't know, and feel free to stay there, and certainly welcome a fuller gallery in our witness table, by all means. If you guys bring more to the table, we'll have to get more MLAs, because well, we wouldn't want to be outnumbered. That said, I now have Ms. Reed, if you'd like to ask and proceed with your first question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to everybody here today. Appreciate greatly your expertise. I am going to kind of continue down the road that Ms. Morgan has led us down. When Norzink was speaking earlier around some of the barriers that you're facing, he spoke about the duplication from environmental assessment, water licensing, and land and water board processes. I am not as well versed on this as Mr. Morse is, so I was wondering if perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on what you see as the duplication. I know that EAs and water licensing are led by the GNWT, land and water board processes are external to that, but yeah, if you could sort of say what pieces carry forward that you would like to see less duplication around. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Vivian, you want to start us off, or?
Well, I can say a lot, but I think let Claudine, as the question was asked directly of her project, so I'll let Claudine answer.
By all means, Ms. Lee, if you would help there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Ms. Reed, a couple of examples when it comes to the process that is in place for the EA and the water boards is there is always a project description, a review of the project steps, the expectations, what's happening, how things are being built, how things are being managed and monitored. That has to go right back to the beginning when we go through surface lease or license of occupation or other land administration steps. That has all been well documented documented, well-reviewed, discussed through public hearings and technical sessions. I think an area where we can be more efficient is to accept that those things have happened, that proper review, engagement, and consultation has happened through those steps, and accept that those components have been completed. And so if a water license and land use permit has been issued, it would have been issued under a scope of work. So that scope of work does not need to go back to the beginning and be reviewed, because that would be in counter to what had already happened, what had been deemed possible for a project with the mitigations in place, and we should be able to move forward. The next area is on engagement and consultation. You know, the GNWT does have its own responsibility to consult, but I think it should be leading from and building upon the engagement that has already been done for the project, because the project would never make it through an environmental assessment, a water license, or a land use permit process without having proper engagement, proper support from the First Nations and the partners in the area. And the water boards and others would have deemed the projects good to go ahead. So we also see that there's additional delay going back to do engagement right from the beginning. We should be building from that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I was typing, so I just assumed it was Mr. Vivian the question was going to first. So my apologies for that. Certainly, by all means. Mr. Vivian, you're now being put on the spot.
Yeah, well, that's a problem. No, it's not a problem. Yeah, I mean, I believe that the way I would have answered that question, which was probably more elegantly put by Claudine, was that you go through a significant process to get a land use permit and a water license. There should be no reason to have any duplication of that when it comes to a surface lease. None.
Thank you for that. And I've known you to be passionate a long time, so don't worry. And we'll call it passionate. Ms. Reed, did you have a further? Oh, not at all. I'll just check with Mr. Morris if he has any further questions. He does, so we'll continue around, and I think we're wrapping up soon. So we're pushing towards the 3 o'clock mark, which puts us just over 20 minutes. I have a couple quick questions of my own, and I'll wait till Mr. Morris is done, or I'll see if I can squeeze him in to build on. So, Mr. Morris, if you would.
Thank you. I've got less preambles now that we've gotten into it, so I can try and be as quick as I can. Gary, you mentioned the MRA regs could include more definitions. Can you speak to this, what you'd like to see specifically there? I'm interested to hear recommendations, and in particular, how definitions in the MRA regs could make things more clear for the Land and Water Board's permitting process, which I think you kind of alluded to. So if you could help us better understand that, it would be appreciated.
Thank you. Just ticked one of my questions off, so we're good. Please, Mr. Vivian.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I think, Julian, I think the simplest answer to that, we've talked about this numerous times. We meet with ITI probably every 2 months on the regs, and I think the main issue that we keep talking about all the time is the mining life cycle. It's just not well understood, and so I think, again, as we've talked about with the water regs, which would help there, is a good definition of what early stage exploration is. Commonly, early stage exploration gets dumped into this same thing NRCan does with statistics, and that is anything that's deposit appraisal or less gets called exploration, and that's not exploration. Early stage exploration should be, and I'll just say it, is something as simple as 2 to 3 drill operation with a 20 to 25 man camp, and it doesn't require a water license. If we could get to that point where somebody has to apply for a land use permit and they can do this for less than $150,000, I would call that a win, because right now, going through the process, the cost to do the engagement and the bond that you would have to post to get the water license and the land use permit is probably going north of $200,000. So I can do this in Ontario except for my time, for $0. Where are you going to put your money? I would suggest the regulatory system in the NWT is better than the one that's in Ontario, absolutely. And the regulatory system has worked very, very well for those more advanced projects, mine developments, and those sorts of things. But there's no breakdown for early stage exploration, and that's where the definition is needed. We talk about no future in diamond mines. Well, I don't believe for a minute that all the kimberlites in the NWT have been found. If anybody knows anything or read anything about South Africa or Botswana, they've been finding kimberlites there for 150 years. We live on probably the best craton in the world. Do we think we're done? But no, that's the message we're telling everybody because nobody's exploring, because it costs too much. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Mr. Morris, please.
Thanks. Yeah, knowing this may be my closing, I would just say, again, I'd like to emphasize that, you know, for all the comments that have been made, the level to which we can get specific recommendations in writing will be very helpful for developing a report, certainly helpful for our staff in producing a report. So I would just encourage that. To get back to the duplication question, I wanted to build upon what Ms. Reed was asking about. So speaking to the significant processes, it sounds like the surface leases have kind of become a bit of an issue on their own. Again, written submission on that would be helpful for us to better understand it, and specifically recommendations for change that you'd like to see. But if we could get into that, I mean, I guess I'd just be looking for a bit more elaboration on that. Is that the only place you're seeing duplication, is just in this kind of issuance of a surface lease? They go back and start a new process all over again? Perhaps you could give kind of a bit more insight into how that works. That's certainly one that's happened outside of the areas that I've worked in, so I don't understand the leasing processes nearly as well.
Mr. Vivian, if you'd lead us off, and if we, not at all.
I think the quick answer to that, Julian, would be that the GNWT's main responsibility in that whole mining project is the surface lease. So that's, I think, the biggest concern right now is that the GNWT is stepping in, which they have the right to do, but they're not using information that currently exists. That's been well documented and is probably at an extremely high standard. So I would suggest that the biggest problem is the surface lease, unless, Karen, you have.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Costello, if you'd like to further elaborate, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think it's important to keep in mind, and this is building on something that Claudine touched on, about the level of detail that's already available. It's not hidden. It's on public registries, and there is absolutely no excuse where that information cannot be resourced. And quite often you'll see other regulators say, well, we need it as a separate package to support your application to us. I think the days of papering your file with making sure you have a stack of paper when you can go to a public registry, which the boards have, showing the records of everything that they've gone through their environmental assessment and through their water licensing. We have to enter the 21st century. This is where the records are, and there's no excuse for staff not to be able to reference it. And someone looking to submit an application saying, if you have that clear definition of everything that's required, you can make a reference and just saying, here's the link to the site, here is the information. You don't have to duplicate it and start from scratch, as Claudine indicated had been the case of having to go back to day one. Thank you.
That's perfect. Mr. Morris, if you want to, we're well within our time, but not to encourage too much. But to the point, Mr. Morris, please, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your indulgence on this one. I just wanted just one last one on the leasing issue. Is this something that a board issuance is required before you can apply for a lease? I guess what I'm thinking here and wondering is there a reason why this leasing process, which is kind of being seen as a duplication, can't occur sort of during or alongside the board's regulatory process, which is public. Can we get it?
Thank you for that. Mr. Vivian, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a good question, Julian, but the simple answer is no. Now, I know, and Mr. Connolly would probably like to speak well to this, to be quite honest, but the way the system has been set up is that you need basically a land use permit and a water license to get to a point where you can define a resource. So that is required, and you can't get a lease until you've delineated what area your mine is going to take up, and then that's how you get a surface lease. The surface lease is given on what you're going to use for the mine development and infrastructure associated with that project, and you don't know that till you get through the whole process of delineating the resource. And I know Mr. Connolly's probably jumping up and down behind me.
Well, he wasn't quite jumping, but I would ask that he does look like he would like to offer some enlightenment. Perhaps we could ask someone just to shuffle out of a chair. Oh, a chair just for ever a moment. Mr. Connolly, if you would, when we pass the mic to you, please maybe identify yourself for the record and then jump in.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't going to speak because I'm not necessarily aware of the particular issue that my colleagues at Canadian Zinc are facing, and I don't want to make their life more difficult by raising any issues. But I would say well over $100,000 have been spent by members of this chamber trying to negotiate a bankable surface lease. So there are two sets of issues with the surface lease. The one that Canadian Zinc has so ably brought forward as it relates to duplication when all this information is already on file. The other is when you go to operate a mine or raise money, you, just like when you buy a house, you need to have title or tenure to the land on which your house is. Otherwise, third-party funders, it may be equity funders who are willing to take a gamble 1,001 chances, are willing to invest in early stages without a surface lease. But when you start putting hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure down on land, you want to know you have tenure to that land and that ministerial discretion can't be exercised without much justification, as has been the case already in an operating mine site here in the Northwest Territories, where everything was in place, the lease was in place, and then the minister came back and made a determination, whoops, we made a mistake, and by the way, the board made a mistake, and now you need to rebuild your building. So there's two issues. One is the set of using information that's available. The second, there's actually three issues: using the information that's available, addressing the issue around ministerial discretion, and there's been at least one, if not two, studies paid for by the NWT comparing the processes in other leading jurisdictions and suggesting what would need, and they were done by independent folks like KPMG, what would need to be done to bring the processes in line with other leading jurisdictions and that provide support that's adequate enough for places like BC and Ontario, so I would presume would be sufficient for here. And then third, the GNWT is on record that why don't they rely, they participate in the board process. The GNWT gets to make comments throughout the board process that are aware of all the risks to the land and all of the comments from other parties. Why do they even need this other process afterwards? And they have said in writing that they don't particularly have confidence in the decision of the board, so they hope to be able to revisit it because it's, and they would say that it's their duty to be able to do that to protect the land for the residents of the GNWT. And I think that may have been a very valid position 30 years ago when the surface leases, more than that. It looks like surface leases were developed for cabins, essentially, more than 30 years ago, or last updated 30 years ago. And the since that time, we've had the act has come, the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Review Act has come into place, and constitutionally and with land claims, that responsibility to protect the land has actually switched from the GNWT to the boards. So I think the problem with the leases is much more than just duplication. They predate and were well intended several generations ago, but we've advanced and now have, as Mr. Vivian suggested, once you get through the process, it's quite a strong and valid process. And that has, in many ways, probably replaced the need for the protections that are built into the lease. And there no longer should be need for ministerial discretion to say, your building should have been purple, you have to stop mining even though you put $200 million into your project. So I didn't mean to complicate it, but you have those three issues, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. Okay. Very good. Okay, so not seeing any further questions from my colleagues, I'm just going to ask a couple. Mr. Morris? No, you're good. I mean, it's not just for me, but it's also for the, and please don't correct me, Mr. Vivian, the millions of subscribers that are on Facebook right now, hanging on every single word of this committee with great interest, potential investors. I'll go to Mr. Morris and we'll proceed from there.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Really appreciate it. And I promise this is my last question, unless these guys bring up more stuff that keeps producing more follow-ups. But I just wanted to dig down into the lease thing a little bit. I realized that I kind of made a bit of a mistake myself that maybe shows I've gotten a bit rusty since the few years ago that I was working at the boards. That, of course, a lease is usually required in order to even be able to apply, because it's sort of the first step that you need to have permission to be on the land. But so that's what brought up the second question. Is this issue of leasing something that's very specific to the Norzinc project, or is this something that becomes a problem for multiple projects? Because I'd just like to get a better understanding of kind of how this leasing issue, and I realize we're getting into quite a technical discussion, and so that's why I wanted to, again, encourage kind of written submissions. But if we could get a bit more clarity on how this leasing issue is kind of a problem industry-wide. Thanks.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Morris. Ms. Lee, if you could frame around your challenge, and of course, don't forget we welcome things in writing as well.
Mr. Chair. The question about whether or not this is just specific to the Prairie Creek file Canadian Zinc issue, it is where we are at in our stage right now. We need a surface lease for the Prairie Creek mine to be able to move forward, but each and every project that will come after us will need the same thing. So I do not expect that it's just a Canadian Zinc, Norzinc issue. Your question from before as well that Gary talked about is, whether or not you need a water license or land use first, and whether or not there's sort of concurrent work. Yes, there can be, but an issuance of a surface lease will not come if you do not have a water license, a land use permit, approved management plans, and all the things that are required underneath that authorization. The responsibility underneath the GNWT is for the lands administration component, and so that's their process. And there is great opportunity to do these things concurrently and not hold up the process. But as Gary mentioned, the surface lease is related to the infrastructure, the use of the surface of the land. And so those components, those maps, those drawings, that engineering is different than what is required in a water license, which in your experience, as well as mitigation plans, approaches, a framework of how you're going to address and adjust to impacts, environmental impacts. And so the needs are different, and you won't get a surface lease without having all those other things in place. So although they don't have to come one after the other, and some of them can be done concurrently, they can't be done exactly at the same time. And I suspect that the companies that follow us that will be next coming up doing this, working on their timelines and getting authorizations in place for those infrastructure construction activities will face the same challenges. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Before we get into questions, I just have a couple, and I think some of them have largely been asked by my colleagues already, which I'm grateful for. So we don't need to duplicate those, and I've heard some excellent answers. But I would say anecdotally, I would almost think that it would be useful for someone in the regulatory side actually provide a full application experience to see what it's like to go through this. Well, I mean that both tongue-in-cheek and seriously, because, I mean, until you know what it's like, it's easy to sit to be the gatekeeper of one application waiting for the next without the experience of realizing how difficult it is to challenge. Now, I mean, our committee doesn't have the time or certainly the resources to file applications ourselves just as a test system, but I'd be really curious the undertaking and the wherewithal required to get through it. You know, given from what I've heard or what I've heard people say in the past, and certainly recently. That said, one's fitness through the process must be certainly tested. I do have a couple quick questions built around definitions, and I've heard not just today, but previously, and certainly from others, with respect to ice bridge challenges. And so, has anyone ever proposed, this has got me thinking around the context of, for example, ice bridge, and I don't profess to be a water expert, so I'm asking a general question with the kindest intent, which is, has anyone ever proposed a definition of ice building or ice road building, such as, you know, if you apply for an ice bridge and you want to make one, you know, per kilometer, they're say $10,000 and you're allowed to use the water as appropriate, assuming it's built around environmental stewardship. So in other words, filtered water, not dirty water, or when I refer to dirty, I'm referring to gas or other types of particulates that would change the nature of the water. So I'll go to Mr. Vivian just out of curiosity, because we hear these challenges about definitions. Has anyone provided them? And that was an example to you, maybe, per se. If you could start with that, Mr. Vivian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that addresses probably some of the biggest issues we have with the Waters Act right now, and that is definitions. We have a definition, we have a serious concern with the definition of water use, and we also have a serious concern about how small stage exploration gets even put into this whole water use thing. So yes, it has been suggested before that we've actually told the GNWT that we're quite willing to sit down and come up with a definition for water use, but there's been no interest on their behalf to deal with that, and they have no interest in, they at least at this point seem to have no interest in dealing with targeted approaches to fixing the amendments. They want to open up the Waters Act, and we think that that's going to be the most detrimental thing you can do to the exploration industry in the NWT, because that'll be years before anything's done. And the boards in CIRNAC agree that we should be addressing targeted amendments to fix problems that can be easily fixed with just a definition.
Thank you for that. I think you agreed earlier to share those letters with us, so that would be very helpful for us to be able to build context around that. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that process or road is correct, but I'm saying it's certainly something should be discussed and looked at in the broader picture, because we're going to have to examine suggestions, and then under our area of scope and ability, I mean, we'll end up coming up with some suggestions and recommendations to the government to consider. So Mr. Vivian, you had a further?
If I could, Mr. Chair, it was brought up earlier about water use on mining and milling projects, and I would use Prairie Creek as an example. There's many others. What we asked of the boards was reconsider the term ice bridge use for water on early stage exploration programs and remove that as part of a water use description in a land use permit or a water license, and they agreed to do that for smaller projects, but it still stays in for miscellaneous or mining and milling projects that they have to count that against their water license, whereas they've agreed for smaller stage exploration projects, which we don't have a definition of, they will not have to include ice bridge water as part of their water use. But I don't know how they came up with that, because to me, ice bridge water use shouldn't be part of your water license. It's called safety.
I'm almost afraid to ask, but yeah, they probably someone probably come up with a reason in some form or fashion as such. So, Mr. Vivian, I'd like to, no disrespect, I got to try to finish, and you can jump in on this because we'll end up going back and forth 7 or 12 times or more. So, feel free to jump in and clarify because I want to bring it to a close as well. We're approaching 3 o'clock, being respectful to my colleagues as well as the gallery and the millions of viewers. Has there ever been a proposal to run concurrent applications, or has there ever been a sense explaining why people can't use applications from one process to the next? And again, this is not news to me. I'm glad you're saying it, and I'm sure my colleagues have heard it before as well. But I mean, it's difficult to imagine that people couldn't work together, especially when they're already working together but separately. So. I know, I feel like I'm answering my own question, but if you had some enlightenment on that as well, because I find it difficult to imagine why either a joint application, concurrent application and whatnot couldn't be working closer together, even if they were 2 different governments or 3 or 4 different governments. In other words, Indigenous, boards, GNWT, feds, and throw somebody else in just for spite. So has there been opposition or feedback on that, please?
If I could, Mr. Chair, I was thinking I wasn't going to have to go here today, but as has been discussed with the current Premier on numerous occasions, I think the industry and the boards have found that ECC, post-ENR or after ENR, I guess, have not been departments that have been easy to get into, to talk to. We've asked as a chamber to meet with ENR on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, much like we have with ITI, and that was never set up by the ENR minister the last time around. And we've asked again with Jay to have bi-monthly meetings. Sorry, Jay McDonald, Mr. McDonald, Minister McDonald, to have bi-monthly meetings with ECC. And we'd love nothing more to do that because we think that some of the decisions that are being made there are not talking to industry, and it directly affects our industry. So I would say there's still this what are we calling that, siloed approach in the departments. And I would say under Minister McDonald, I heard some great things when we met with the MLAs at the end of November in 2023. And I'm still slightly encouraged from some of the things the minister's saying, but we still haven't been offered the meetings, the bi-monthly meetings. I do quarterly. I do every 6 months if I could, just to get a foot in the door to explain to them what the issues are and some of the decisions that they're making. So I would say I think it's internally, a lot of it's a GNWT problem, especially when it comes to water regs. Now, there are interpretive issues that are coming out of the boards, and I've said this to the current ED, that it's gone on that when there's new interpretations of the regulations, we're never notified. We aren't asked what our opinion is, they just show up. And that's a problem, because you're setting the regulations to regulate us, but you get no feedback from us on what it's going to cause, and so funding, people, capacity issues, to be quite honest, and it's significant.
I'm sorry to hear about that challenge. So I'm going to recognize the clock, which means I'm even going to cut myself off. I've got a couple more questions, but I can always ask them privately. It's fine. I don't want to keep my colleagues stranded here just for 1 or 2. That said, I'll say from my perspective, I don't know how committee feels, but I would say I would encourage you to write a formal letter and maybe copy committee specific to that issue, and committee will decide where it belongs in that issue. But at least it'll aid in our discussions in the future. Now, whether we respond or act to it, that'll be up to committee at large, but I would encourage that by separate letter. Okay. That said, as I mentioned, I'm going to recognize the clock. We're a little past 3 o'clock. And I want to thank the NWT and Nunavut Chamber of Mines for your time, as well as their friends and guests in the audience. It's been most helpful to hear your perspective. As everyone knows, both online and in the room, We're working on this project to see what we can do within our scope, and one must keep that in mind. I mean, there are many issues outside of the scope that are well beyond our reach, and they're valid. But that said, we have to work within our lane. The committee may decide to make observations down the road, but again, keeping in mind we have to work with what's before us and our ability. So at this time, I'm now going to say we are closed for the day. I appreciate your time, and the committee is grateful for those who were able to participate. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.